Hi there. This video is an asynchronous lesson looking at the impact of education policy, specifically on gender, class and ethnicity. So this is the area that we come to when we've studied the whole timeline of policies. We've looked, right up until the 2010 onwards policies, and we're up to the present day. And we're starting to look at the impact and the effect of these policies and the argued effect from different perspectives and different groups. So what you need ready for this asynchronous lesson is your learning material so you can take notes as you are going along. Feel free to press pause at any point where you want to be able to look at the slide and take notes at your own pace. And also, please do note down any questions that you want to ask or any reteach that you would like to request based on any of the policies or areas that come up, because that's part of the consolidation process, that you pick out those important parts where you may need some support to make sure that that learning is really embedded. So let's move on to our first slide. And what we've got here is a table that I'm going to give you a few minutes to work on. And I would like you to have a think about the impact of these policies and the evaluation of them. So if you imagine that someone has already told you the positives of each of these, and you are now going to say, well, however, we could argue that. So the positive would be the original intention of the policy. So EMA, for example, this was intended to support the students who may not have stayed on otherwise. It was money that went directly to them. It was £30 a week into their bank account. And that could have made a difference, or did make a difference, to the staying on rates in schools post 16. And your however would be something that links to why that may not be having an impact now, or why it may have only impacted certain groups. So what we want to think about here are the winners and losers, long-term and short-term. Does the policy still exist? So it may have had benefits, but then it may have been scrapped, maybe by a different government or in a different time. And then think about certain groups who may have benefited, and maybe subgroups within the group that the policy was aimed at who didn't actually benefit in the way that they should. So I'd like you to spend 6 minutes now, and I'm going to start the timer. So please spend 6 minutes working through each of these. So you've got 5 different government policies there, and you don't have to do the positive bit. You're simply doing the however, and you're looking at the kind of limitations or the detrimental side. Okay, so I will start the timer now. Okay, so well done for taking the time to put your ideas down in that box. Here are some suggested answers, but remember you may have chosen other evaluations that are still relevant and still valid. If you're unsure and you'd like clarification of whether your suggestions were valid, then make a note of that as you go through so that you can ask at the end of this session when you're live with me, okay? So we've got EMA, and we talked about that briefly at the beginning. The way we can evaluate this is it was actually withdrawn by the coalition government and it was replaced by the bursary scheme, which still offers some support for those less economically privileged students, but it does actually is given to far less students, and it is a smaller amount of money, and it is a termly amount. It's not a kind of weekly top up like the EMA was, which was so valuable to so many students. So we can talk about the impact on the less economically affluent students and the impact, therefore, on maybe staying on. If you really wanted to go into depth, you could talk about the fact that now all students have to stay on till 18. However, some will still have a pressure to earn. So they will do things like jobs where they're training on the job, things like MVQs, McDonald's management programs, that kind of thing would still count. Or they would do an apprenticeship because at least they know there's some money coming in. So actually, do we want it to become a privilege to stay on and do A-levels and pursue an academic route in school? Probably, most governments would say no, we want there to be equal access to further and higher education for young people. Pupil premium, obviously still going, imaginably a big impact of that because it is used in so many different ways for the students that it's assigned to. But the criticisms are, however, not only Ofsted, but the Sutton Trust as well, two quite reliable sources and probably not biased sources, have found that the pupil premium money is often spent, and it is ring fenced, but it's often still somehow not spent on the students it's directed to. And there've been some other studies as well as these two mentioned here, that show that sometimes the pupil premium money is used to plug the gap of the cutting of funding for education that's happened throughout those years of austerity. So there is an argument that that money is not necessarily going directly to the people who it was meant for, and therefore that would minimise the impact. Aim Higher, that was a new Labour programme. There were huge amounts of funding that came into schools and colleges, and there were loads of different programmes, and you could use your Aim Higher funding to do things to really nurture those students who might not otherwise consider going to university or might not have the cultural capital in order to apply and be successful. So there were loads of these Aim Higher programs, and then that was scrapped, and actually the gap is widening once again in terms of who goes to which universities, particularly at the more prestigious universities. Comprehensivisation, I hope you spotted the typo in there. I hope you spelled comprehensivisation right, because there is an N missing in the middle there. So comprehensivisation obviously created a more inclusive system than the tripartite system, because even though the tripartite system was aiming to support, to give this meritocratic opportunity to the working class yet very intelligent, bright, keen students, what happened was it turned into a kind of parentocracy game, didn't it? And people started to prepare for it, and therefore middle class kids were getting in, and it just became part of social reproduction instead of something that people like Nigel Farage will still argue should be disrupting social reproduction and providing these opportunities for social mobility. Theresa May, as well, big fan of grammar schools, really thinks that they are like a hub of social mobility. So we can criticise the tripartite system, but then comprehensivisation came in to try and undo some of this, and we can criticize that because we still have this marketized system where there's a selection by mortgage, and academization has then brought in hidden selection and policies, over subscription policies, and ways that children are still selected into certain schools. Hard to place children have arisen out of this system. Comprehensivisation, so obviously these schools still vary between the areas that they're in. And one other evaluation that's really important here is that not all of the UK has gone, as we well know, has gone to comprehensivisation. Many areas of the UK have remained with the grammar system and the bipartite system. And finally, we've got the Sure Start centres, and these were a big new Labour initiative, and they were springing up in areas that really needed them, providing whole family support and arguably giving interventions that came in really early in young people's lives to provide them with far better life chances and to try and level that playing field, which so many sociologists have shown that think about Feinstein and the language differences between working class, middle class children in very young ages. So these came in to provide a really holistic type of support. And at their peak in 2010, there were 3,600 children's centres across the UK. And it had this huge budget, as you can see there. But actually between 500 to 1,000 of those have closed, and many of them have had to kind of merge or had funding cut and not be able to run the same services over those years, those coalition years. So we can argue that the Sure Start centres had this, a huge impact, but actually have not been able to maintain the wider impact that they had, especially for the areas that have lost their local centres. So moving on, another activity for you here. Which policies do you think have made class inequalities actually worse rather than better? So you might have to dig quite deep here. You may want to have a look back through your notes and really have a think and just create a bit of a mind map brainstorm type thing here where you are putting down all of your ideas and try to come up with 3 or 4 points here. Which policies have been brought in that have made class inequalities worse or have made the education system less fair? So I'll give you some time for that. And if you'd like to press pause, then you can obviously take as much time as you need. So well done. Now we're looking at policies which could be argued to have increased class inequality. So there are some ideas here. You may have brought in some others. Again, if you're unsure whether they are definitely okay and accurate to use, then note them down and do check when we come back together live at the end of this asynchronous lesson. So we've got university tuition fees. Because they've been brought in, it's created a divide between who can and can't afford to go to university, or an impact of debt, which will then impact other things later on in people's lives. New Labour brought those in at £3,000 a year, but then they went up under the coalition to £9,000 a year. So, and they were means tested initially, and now everyone pays them. And although they don't have to pay them up front, it still has a big impact. So that we can arguably, say has increased class inequalities, especially as we've got studies that say certain people from working class backgrounds are put off university because of the debt. Giving schools the power to select students. Now, the Academies Act has given schools the power to have more selection in terms of their admissions. There are some laws in place to try and stop certain students being discriminated against. However, we are seeing that kind of hidden selection happening with academies. So that's another, that kind of open enrolment, but particularly through academisation, is giving more selection power to schools, and schools are under pressure for the results and the league table places. Therefore, they're doing what they need to do, but there are children who are a victim of that. The tripartite system, we can argue actually that in 1944, bringing that in created a huge social reproduction system. Even though that wasn't the intention, it was arguably the outcome. Marketisation and parental choice. Gerwitz tells us, and there's been plenty of other studies as well, that this benefits the middle classes and it benefits the parents who can use their social, economic and cultural capital. Scrapping of EMA, of course, scrapping of aim higher, scrapping of university grants, all of those things that really leveled the playing field for students wanting to stay on after 16 and after 18. And then finally, we've got the academies and free schools policies, bringing those in. And the Nuffield report, that 4-year report with all of those different bits of evidence, really show that academies and free schools have created big amounts of inequality, as evidenced by the Nuffield report and other studies as well. So there, maybe pause on this slide if you want to be able to make some more notes. Okay, so your next task is to have a look at the question on this slide and make some notes on which policies you can think of that have addressed gender inequality. So anything that's been brought in to try and address the balance in terms of differentials in gender for achievement, but also in terms of subject choice as well. So if you stop the video for a couple of moments while you do that, and then pick up when you're ready to move on. Okay, so let me move myself out of the way here. Hopefully you came up with some ideas. We have got the most well-known initiatives that have been brought in, GIST and WISE, which were looking at getting girls into subjects where they are underrepresented. We've got girls into science and technology, women into science and engineering. And this kind of idea that we can raise participation and then therefore that will impact on the economy later on as well. However, when you do look at the recent figures, subjects like A-level physics and A-level computer science, girls are still incredibly underrepresented. But we can flip that with the evaluation that those numbers are growing. So there is a steady change taking place. And of course, liberal feminists would view that as very positive. Radical feminists would probably view that as, really not happening fast enough. We also have got an argument we can bring in about coursework. Was coursework something that came in as a policy that accidentally impacted positively on girls? Girls have been proven through some studies to perform better in coursework than boys. It tends to lend to their nature better. However, we can argue that again because in 2015, coursework was taken away and girls are still outperforming at the moment, even without coursework in most subjects. So we can kind of bring it in as an argument and then we can offer a flip side, which creates that wonderful balance in your essays. We've also seen removal of gender stereotyping in textbooks, and that it's hard to measure the impact of that because obviously it really happened quite gradually as things were sort of removed and as books were revised and republished. But at least now it's not there, so it is a kind of positive thing. But you can sort of flip that with, however, even if we remove it from education, it's still very evident in the media, in popular culture, in advertising and that kind of thing. But it's still kind of worth mentioning that it's been brought in order to help deal with sort of gender stereotyping, labelling and those kind of gender scripts in schools that then affect subject choice. You could also mention the external influence of policies that aren't directly education related, but things like the equal opportunity laws, like the Equal Pay Act and some of the discrimination laws from 1975 onwards, really, that have also helped with the approach to girls' education, really. Also, there have been, it's not mentioned on this slide, but there have been some policies to try and increase boys' performance and, initiatives in schools to try and get boys more into education and especially at the younger level and try and level the playing field that way. So you may research those and bring some of those into your essays as well. So moving on, your next task, I bet you can guess what's coming next because you've done this for gender and class. So I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes and see what you can get together yourself. It's up to you if you do this as a memory recall task or if you want to look up in your notes. And we're looking here at making some notes on the policies that have negatively affected those from ethnic groups. So it may be policies that have done this kind of by accident. It may obviously wouldn't have been the intention of the policies, but can you have a think about what you've studied so far and policies that have had a negative effect on certain, not all ethnic groups, but certain ethnic groups. And if you can name some examples of the groups, that would be really helpful as well. So if you pause the video here and give yourself a couple of moments to create your ideas on a sheet of paper. Okay, so well done. Here are some suggested responses that you may have had. So you may have talked about, and this is quite a well-known study from Gilborn. He looked at the Young Gifted and Talented programs and when they were run kind of in the early noughties through that period. And he found that white students were twice as likely to be selected for those programs. So that kind of continued this kind of ongoing recognition and desire for that kind of white cultural capital, and those kind of rewarding of whiteness in the education system. So David Gilbourne kind of picked up that therefore having programs like this would have a negative effect on students who would not get picked for these programs, and probably for the wrong reasons, So a bit like when you look at the examples of setting and streaming, students are being put in the bottom set, but it's not always because of academic ability. Similar situation here. Education action zones was positive for many ethnic groups because they were focused on underprivileged urban areas where there would be high representation of young people from certain ethnic groups, and that actually would have helped those people because there'd be more investment going into those areas and those schools. But of course, you can evaluate that by saying that education action zones were actually scrapped and that they're not in place now. So the impact clearly has ended. Aim Higher actually did encourage more people from BAME backgrounds or from ethnic groups that would normally underachieve. That encouraged them into higher education, and it really started to level to sort of reduce the gap between different ethnic groups of students. But of course, Aim Higher was also scrapped. However, there are still programs that are aimed at getting students in from underprivileged areas, which would then impact on those same groups of people. So we do still have plenty of programs in place, and there are a lot of programs that are aimed to help students, get students visiting universities. There are, a lot of like King's College run kind of 8-week programs for students that might be given contextual offers to come and take part in, to really build their UCAS applications. So it does still happen, but Aim Higher specifically was scrapped. EMA, of course, similar, had an effect on people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, which would have impacted. And we've got studies that say that Pakistani, Bengali students are most likely to be from, not always, it's too much of a stereotype otherwise, but statistically more likely to be from disadvantaged backgrounds. Therefore, things like EMA would help those groups of students. So these policies that were inadvertently supporting certain ethnic groups, even though they were specifically aimed at class, are still relevant to bring in. And there's also another study from David Gilbourne that marketisation has impacted negatively on certain ethnicities. Probably similar story to the sort of cases we're looking at here, where it's the people from certain disadvantaged areas who would be most disadvantaged by marketisation policies and this rewarding of kind of cultural and economic capital. So that's something else to bring in, and you can cite that with David Gilbourne as your evidence. So if you want to pause for a moment, I'm just going to remove my camera from the slide so you've got the whole slide here in case you want to pause to take any notes. Okay, and finally, we've got here to sum up everything that we've looked at in terms of the impact of education policies on equality in society. We've got one of these wonderful hectic teacher knowledge organisers here, which are absolutely brilliant for using as memory retrieval or for simply reorganising all of your revision notes into one place. And these would be great to come back to when you are revising for these exams at a later date. What we will spend some time on this in class, so you do not have to complete this knowledge organiser now, but what you may want to do is think about how you're going to complete that when you are given time. So are you able to print a copy, in which case I can send you a PDF file for this. Or if you're not able to print a copy, or if you don't want to print a copy, you may want to simply take a note of the headings and reproduce this as your own sheet on whatever size paper you like. You may want to reproduce separate tables here in separate places or on separate sheets. It's completely up to you and your style of how you like to lay out your reduced revision notes when you're consolidating at the end of a topic. I'll just move over here so that you can see all of the headings. If it's not that clear on this slide, I can send you a copy as well. Or these are available on the Hectic Teacher website, which we're incredibly grateful for because they're brilliant. So we've got the 4 aims of education policy. So what are the, the main reasons? Actually, 3 aims of education policy that there are there. And then we've got Gilborn and Udell, who've done a lot of studies on looking at equality within educational policy. We've then got some example policies there to bring in school admissions codes, comprehensivisation, 1988, of course, and then a space here to put some other policies. And then we've got types of selection, arguments against selection. A lot of this is on the evidence board on the on our Sociology Sarah website. Over subscription policies, I've got something on the next slide just to show you for that. Covert selection. If you haven't come across Tough and Brooks and you've just looked at covert selection in general, then have a look at Tough and Brooks, and it brings some information in there because they're great to use as evidence. Open enrolment and parental choice, we've got down the bottom here, and arguments in favour of selection as well. So there's a lot of information you want to be drawing out from your notes. And just because it mentions over subscription policies, I wanted to show you, and this is Kent County Council. Let me just check the time there. Okay, so this is the school admissions criteria for Kent County Council, and as you'll see in the middle, it says there, every school has a set of rules called oversubscription criteria, and these are the rules that they use in order to decide who gets offered places in schools. So the criteria are students who've been looked after or in care tend to get a priority. Students who have a sibling at the school get priority. Students who live close to the school get priority. Now that starts to bring in that selection by mortgage, doesn't it? Students from a particular faith for faith schools, so that's a different form of selection. And then we've got students who do well in an entrance exam. So then we have got this way of having a different form of selection for schools. And of course that criteria can change and it is different in different councils, but that's what we mean when we talk about oversubscription criteria. And you can link that in with hidden selection. Okay, so that's all from me. If you want to go back and look at all this video, it's on YouTube, but it will be in Nearpod as an asynchronous lesson with questions embedded. So you may be watching it on either one of those at the moment. I hope it's been helpful. Please bring along any questions to class and make sure you ask and make sure you fill those learning gaps. And hopefully that's been a good consolidation activity and that you feel ready to move on to the next topic area now. Well done.